G'day guys, welcome back to the channel, and welcome back for another Space Engineers tutorial video. So in today's video what we're going to do is we are going to discuss everything you need to know about thrusters. So obviously in the game there are three different types of thrusters. There are hydrogen, ion and atmospheric. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this video up into 5 different sections, and I will place timestamps for each section in the video description so that you can just skip to the parts that are relevant to you. So in the first part we're going to discuss how you can calculate how many thrusters you need for a ship, or basically how much thrust your thrusters that are already on the ship can give you, and if it's actually going to lift the ship off the ground. And the second, third and fourth section will basically be on all of the other thrusters. So I'll go over the pros and cons of hydrogen, atmospheric and then ion thrusters, and then we will talk about the differences between small thrusters and large thrusters, and if it's worth using small over large and all that sort of stuff. And I don't just mean small grid versus large grid, I actually mean so basically these small thrusters versus these big thrusters here. So anyway, the first thing that I want to cover is basically how you can work out if your thrusters are actually powerful enough. So in front of us here we have the Atlas Mark II. Now I will provide a link for this in the video description as well, but basically this is my large grid hydrogen ship. So as you can see on the bottom we have a whole bunch of small thrusters, and we've got some more there, and then at the rear we have a whole bunch of large thrusters. So what you can do to work out what this ship is capable of lifting is you can add all of these thrusters together, and you can see here on this LCD I've actually placed all the values for all the different types of thrusters. So you can see here large grid hydrogen, I've got my small thrusters, and each one of those will give you 1.1 meganewtons worth of thrust, and each one of the large thrusters will give you 7.2 meganewtons of thrust. So you add all these thrusters together, of which on this particular ship that equals 74 meganewtons, because we got 28 small thrusters and we got 6 large thrusters. And then obviously, you know, we times 28 by that value, and then we times 6 by that value, and then, you know, we add those two together and we end up with 74 meganewtons. But anyway, the formula to work out what these thrusters are actually going to lift is newtons divided by the gravity of the planet that you're on at the time. Now obviously we are on planet Pertam, and what I have done here is I have actually listed the different gravity ranges for all of the different types of planets. So, you know, we have our moons, which are 0.25 gravity. We've got Mars, which is 0.9 gravity. We've got Earth, which is 1g. Then we've got, you know, alien planet, which is 1.1, and we've got Pertam, which is 1.2. And you can see that right near my welder in the bottom right hand corner of that console there. It says P gravity 1.20 g. So that is basically the gravity. So you basically, yeah, you get your newtons, you divide that by the gravity in meters per second. But in order to make this all work, you actually need to convert this 74 meganewtons into newtons. And obviously a meganewton is 1 million newtons. So this works out to be 74 million newtons. So you go 74 million divided by 11.77, as that is the gravity of this planet, and we come up with a value of 6.286 million kilos. So that is what these thrusters can actually lift. Now obviously the values for all the different types of thrusters change, and you can see here we've got the large grid atmospheric, we've got the large grid ion, and you can see the values are all different. So obviously the kilonewtons is basically thousands of newtons, so that would be 648,000 newtons, and this would be 6.48 million newtons. And then obviously over here we have the values for our small grid thrusters. So what I'll do is I'll probably just get rid of my welder, and I'll just sit here for a second so you guys can get a, you know, if you want to, you can pause the video and just take a look over these values here. Alright, well, I think that's long enough for you guys to pause it. Let's go ahead and have a look at the control panel of this particular ship. So, you remember we worked out that the ship could lift 6.2 million kilos with all the thrusters that it has, and this ship weighs 3.7 million kilos. So if I go and turn the landing gears off and we lift off the ground, you can see it's more than capable of getting off the ground. So yeah, very good. Now what it also means is that we have room for a whole bunch of cargo, so we can actually fill this ship up quite a bit. So we could probably get away with, yeah, anything under 6.3 million kilos, we can fill the ship up with that, and then we'll still be able to get off the ground. Now I should point out that all of this stuff only really matters if you want to exit and enter planets. If you plan on being in space, then it really doesn't matter how many thrusters you have. It honestly doesn't matter. So the only thing that it really affects is the ability to exit the atmosphere of a planet, and maybe the performance of a ship that is solely in space. So with all that said and done, what we're going to do now is we're going to discuss atmospheric thrusters. So if we have a look at the atmospheric thrusters over here, so I've done the same thing. I've put a whole bunch of LCDs here so we can kind of go over all the values. Now, atmospheric thrusters are some of the most interesting thrusters in the game. So obviously, atmospheric thrusters, the pros for those are they are easy to place on your ship, they're relatively powerful, and they don't require any fuel. So the cons are that obviously they can't be used in space, and then also the higher you go in an atmosphere, the less effective they become. So at a certain point you will reach high enough in the atmosphere where these thrusters no longer work. So you need to kind of keep that in mind. So for example, if you have a cargo ship that is supported only by these thrusters, and you know, you kind of need to add maybe 10 to 20% extra thrust to it just to make sure that you can clear obstacles like mountains, because you know, you will ascend the ship to try and clear a mountain range, and you'll find that the ship can't actually go that high because you've loaded it up to the absolute brim and it doesn't have any extra power. Now, the most interesting thing about atmospheric thrusters is you can see all these values here are different. So atmospheric thrusters actually have more or less lift depending on which planet you're on. So if we have a look at the large grid atmospheric thrusters, you can see I've got all the values listed out here for the different planets. So on Mars, the small grid thruster will give you 485.8 kilonewtons. On Earth, it'll give you more. On Europa, it'll give you even more than that. And on Alien, Pertam, Titan, and Triton, these are all the same. It will give you these values. And yeah, so the same is true with the small grid atmospheric thrusters. And you can see the only real difference here is that small grid atmospheric thrusters are stronger on Europa, or less strong on Europa than they are on Earth. So whereas the large grid variants are the other way around. So I actually found that to be quite interesting. So yeah, that is basically everything you need to know about atmospheric thrusters. And again, you can use these values, plug them into that formula, and you can work out how many of these thrusters you need to lift your ship, or you can basically put enough thrusters on your ship to lift a given goal weight that you want to lift. So let's say, you know, you want to lift 8 million kilos or whatever. You can kind of, you know, keep adding thrusters together until you get to that weight. So next we will have a look at hydrogen thrusters. I probably should have done these first, but oh well, that's all right. So hydrogen thrusters are probably my favorite thruster in the game. I really like them because I find them to be very powerful. Now, the good thing about hydrogen thrusters is that they are as powerful at sea level, or in the middle of an atmosphere, or in space, and as everywhere else. So they will always have the exact same value in thrust. So they'll always give you, 1.1 meganewtons in terms of the small thrusters and 7.2 meganewtons for the large thrusters. So yeah, you don't really need to worry about putting multiple different types of thrusters on your ship. They will literally work everywhere and have the exact same power. So yeah, that's definitely a pro. Another pro is that they don't require any power. Another pro is, obviously the amount of thrust that they provide you. So hydrogen thrusters are actually the most powerful thruster in the game. So each one of these thrusters will give you a lot more than, say, one atmospheric thruster or one ion thruster. So there is that too. Obviously, one of the big cons with hydrogen thrust is that you need to have kind of like an intricate plumbing system. So, and together with that, you need to basically provide fuel tanks. So if we go inside this ship and we just have a look, I'll just show you the hydrogen tank setup that we've got in here. So obviously you can see that we've got a whole bunch of hydrogen tanks. Now these obviously add a whole bunch of weight, and they also require a lot of ice to fill up. And the other downside is that you need to run piping to all of the different thrusters on the ship. So it can get rather complex, especially if you want to place a thruster somewhere and you can't get a conveyor behind it or a conveyor tube or something like that. The other downside to that, that is kind of related to having to run conveyor systems to these thrusters, is that sometimes you might find yourself in a position where you're in a firefight and you might find that a portion of your ship, say here, is damaged, and some of the conveyors that lead to this thruster here are damaged, and then all of a sudden this thruster no longer can receive fuel, and even though the thruster is absolutely fine, it will actually stop working because it can't receive any fuel. So sometimes, yeah, that's definitely a disadvantage to hydrogen thrust over the atmospheric and the ion thrusters. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to cover the last type of thruster in the game, and that is ion thrusters. So you can see I have another ship here which is basically a heavy armor corvette, and this is designed for space only, and as you can see it is an ion ship through and through, so it only has ion thrusters. So yeah, I've basically just placed this down on the planet and I've pinned it down so that it can't go anywhere, because this thing would not be able to support itself on this planet. So obviously the pros are that, these thrusters are relatively powerful in space. Well, I mean, realistically, they're the only thruster apart from hydrogen that you can use in space. And they don't require any fuel, so you don't need to worry about complicated conveyor systems, and they are perfect for small ships like this, where you don't really need to worry about where you're placing them, and running pipes to and from the thrusters and that sort of stuff. And, you can literally place them anywhere and they will receive power, so there's no problems with that. And funnily enough, ion thrusters are actually somewhat effective in the atmosphere. So even though they are technically a space thruster, they will actually still provide you with about 20% thrust at sea level. So if I go into the cockpit of this ship here, I'll just demonstrate this. So what we'll do is we will just set the thrust override on one of these thrusters and I will show you that. So let's just pick any old thruster, and you can see that it actually does provide us with thrust. And the higher you go in the atmosphere, the higher this value will go as well. So technically you could build a ship that is solely ion and it could fly in the atmosphere, but you would need an absolutely enormous amount of ion thrusters. So if you are planning to do it that way, then it's probably good to use a mixture of ion thrusters and atmospheric thrusters together. And as I mentioned before, another pro with these is that you don't need to use obviously piping. So what can happen is if your ship is damaged, all of these blocks around this thruster here could be damaged, and as long as there is one block still connected to the rest of the grid, then this thruster will continue to function. So that is quite nice. And obviously the other downside to these thrusters is that they're only 20% effective, so that's kind of a con and a pro. And then the other one is obviously these are the weakest thrusters in the game. So yeah, these thrusters for their size are a lot weaker than the atmospheric thrusters, and they are even more so when you compare them against the hydrogen thrusters. The good thing about ion thrusters though is that the large ones only take up an area of 2 wide by 3 long, whereas the large hydrogen thrusters, yeah, they basically take up a 9 by 9 area. Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything we need to know about the thrusters and how we can work out how many different thrusters we need. Now what I wanted to cover is the difference between small thrusters and large thrusters. So what we'll do is we'll cover the hydrogen thrusters first. Now you can see that, as I mentioned just before, these thrusters here take up an area of 9 by 9. So we have 3 blocks this way and 3 blocks this way as well. So yeah, a 9 by 9 area. Now if I was to get rid of this large thruster, for example, so let's just say we delete that, and then we come in here and then we replace that thruster with a whole bunch of small hydrogen thrusters. Where are they? Here they are. So we'll grab a whole bunch of small hydrogen thrusters, and we'll just place them all here like this. So we'll just place them down. We'll just do that. Now this will actually give me more thrust here than this one single thruster. So this single thruster here will give me 7.2 meganewtons worth of thrust, and these 9 thrusters, each being 1.1, will give me 9.9 meganewtons worth of thrust. Now the other good thing about arranging hydrogen thrusters like this is that you don't use any more fuel than the thrust that they provide. So what I mean is, so yes, it will use more thrust, but it would be the equivalent. So let's say you had the same amount of thrust provided by small thrusters and large thrusters. Large and small thrusters would still use the same amount of fuel per given thrust. I hope that makes sense. The only downside of doing it this way is that obviously you use a lot of PCU. So if we have a look at this one thruster, it uses a PCU of 15. If we have a look at this one, it uses a PCU of 15 as well. So you're basically, multiplying your PCU by like 9. And then you're further worsening the situation by having to place a whole bunch of conveyors behind these thrusters to actually run them. And one thing that some people might not even know as well is that conveyors in Space Engineers are kind of a block that you want to avoid as much as possible. So if we basically, what I'll do is I'll just place a conveyor down here, and I'll give you guys an idea of why you want to keep your conveyors to a minimum. So we'll just place it there. Now every time a component, a piece of ore or maybe some fuel reaches one of these conveyors, the game has to figure out which way it's going to go. So say, a piece of fuel or a component or something like that hits this conveyor edge here. So the game has to go, okay, well, is it coming out of here? No. Is it coming out of there? 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 Yes. So it basically has to check every single port to see where the component or the fuel or anything that you want to send through these conveyors is going. So the more conveyors you use, the slower your game becomes. And it's entirely dependent on the CPU in your system, and it's really hard to measure. It does really only start to affect you if you've got ridiculous amounts of conveyors, but it is still something to keep in mind. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly get rid of these. Actually, no, I'll leave them. So let's move on to the atmospheric thrusters. Now, with atmospheric thrusters, they are a little bit different to hydrogen thrusters in this respect. So if we are to do the same thing and we are to replace one of these large atmospheric thrusters with, say, 9 small atmospheric thrusters, then you would not get the same amount of thrust. You would actually get less. And then on top of that, you would actually use more power for the privilege. So if I was to replace this one large thruster with 9 small ones, I would, number one, use more power, and number two, I would get less thrust. So wherever possible, I would recommend that you use the large variants of the thrusters, whether they be large grid or small grid. Now, obviously, there are some cases where, I guess constraints on the amount of room that you have on your ship require you to use these small thrusters. But in terms of lifting thrusters, like on the bottom of your ship, I would always recommend to do so with the large atmospheric thrusters. Now, the same is true for ion thrusters as well. So if I was to replace this one ion thruster with 6 of these smaller ion thrusters, because as I said before, it's a 2x3 arrangement, so we would fit 6 in this area, then again we would find ourselves in the exact same position as using the atmospheric thrusters. So we would use, number one, we would use more power, and number two, we would not get the same amount of thrust. So finally, just to finish up this video, I will actually show you what happens once we start gaining a bit of altitude in the atmosphere and how the thrusters react. So I don't actually have any atmospheric thrusters on this ship, but I will demonstrate this using the ion thrusters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the control panel here, I'm going to find an ion thruster, and then I'm going to set the override, which it's already done on this ship for some reason. So you can see that obviously the thrust is 69.1 kilonewtons. So just take a note of that value. Alright, so let's unlock the landing gear and let's rise up to maybe about 1,000 meters into the atmosphere, and let's see what happens to that value once we get up about that high. So we'll try and accelerate as fast as we can here, and I think that should be enough. This will be far enough where we can kind of demonstrate this. Alright, so we're 800 meters up. So if I go back into the control panel, we find our ion thruster again, and remember it was 69.1 kilonewtons, and then we turn that on. You can see that that value has pretty much doubled. In fact, yeah, it has doubled. So the higher you get in the atmosphere, the more effective ion thrusters become, and the less effective atmospheric thrusters become. So what you can do is you can, instead of making a hydrogen ship, you can make a ship that uses both atmospheric thrusters and ion thrusters, and then it uses solely battery power. And obviously all the room that you save by not having to place hydrogen tanks in your ship, you can then use to run large reactors, more thrusters, and all that sort of stuff. So it really is up to you guys what you want to use, and I think I crashed the ship a little bit doing that, but that's alright. So yeah, as I said, it is personal preference on what you guys want to use, but I do find hydrogen probably to be the easiest for me. But anyway, I hope all this information was helpful. Hopefully it makes it easier for you guys to make a decision on exactly what thrusters you want to use and where you plan to use them. So if this information was helpful for you guys, then please consider leaving us a like, and then consider subscribing so that you don't miss any future tutorial videos. Alright guys, well I hope to see you in the next video, and thanks very much for joining me.